personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. I have a special guest on the show, all the way from the Isle of Man, Kurt Roosen. He is the head of innovation for the Isle of Man Government Digital Agency. Welcome.
Very pleased to be here. And that's quite a mouthful to say in one go there.
You and I are connected on LinkedIn. I thought that your background and the things that you do are really interesting. So I'm very interested in emerging tech, things like that. But I would love your perspective, especially when you work with governments on innovation. I don't think people associate governments with innovation. So this is even more interesting to me. But then also, it's so funny because a lot of times when people talk about countries that have EU adequacy, Isle of Man is on that list, right? And a lot of people don't even know where that is, and they don't know, what you guys are doing. So what's your career trajectory into your role that you're in now?
Okay. I've got a kind of long history in the IT industry. So I'd like to think I was one of the kind of first people who went through university and did an IT course to be an IT professional. More years than I want to admit to when I graduated, went straight into the IT industry. I'll kind of frame my university journey in that this was before the internet existed. But what that gives you is a really interesting perspective because you were there when things were created. You could see how things were constructed. And much as people like to say everything we see is new and glossy, everything has its roots back somewhere else. And if you go back far enough, you've kind of seen things before, just called something different. For example, we talk about artificial intelligence now being this wonderful new thing. But if you go back even further than me, it was the late 1950s when robot advice or bots actually were invented and started being put into use. And Deep Blue that we know about was playing chess with Russians many, many years back. So I like to think that I'm kind of the first batch of IT professionals, that people that didn't come from somewhere else, that weren't scientists that had moved or accountants that had moved or people of that nature. And that meant that my kind of training was really about how to make use of IT as opposed to just having it. So that taking it out of academia and bringing it into the real world, so to speak. And I think that journey has really given me quite a lot of empathy for the people who actually use IT and a lot of concern for the bad use of IT and the bad use of data. And that's really what got me into the whole privacy, as we call it. Really the whole how you put security together, how you economics work. I'm a great fan of a lady called Shoshana Zuboff, always a very difficult thing to say, who kind of coined the phrase surveillance capitalism. And I think that's right. She kind of talked about a shift of people or consumers of technology not being customers, not being employees, not being products, but actually being the raw materials of the economy, that people were using their information to sell to them and define that kind of economic strategy. Now, that's great when it works for you. It's very, very bad when it works against you. Just to add to that flavor, in the many roles that I've had, in 2019, whilst head of IT for a bank here, we went through a data hack that was one of the biggest in the region. And I'm one of those very, very rare IT directors that started off in the hack and was able 2 years later to still be in the same place remediating it. So I got to see the whole thing. And that was actually, given the fact I've been in IT for so long, a really scary thing. And to be at really what was a war at that point, a tiny little bank in the middle of nowhere that people have never heard of, that was essentially attacked by the Russian state, as it turned out. And you then wonder why they did that. Well, why did they do that? Because they wanted some information. They didn't want money. They didn't want to do anything to the bank, but they wanted to know about somebody who was at the bank. And then that's what really kind of brings home to you when you're going through that really horrible process, how important privacy aspect is to everybody and why it's so important to protect it. And that's not just from those bad guys, the hackers, but sometimes from what we perceive as the good guys, the big corporates that want to use your data, sometimes not for the best of purposes. That's kind of my journey. Going into government and innovation, yes, I'm often told by my colleagues that I am the only person in the Isle of Man government that has the word innovation in their job title. There's a kind of heavy responsibility to do something with it. And I'm very much about positive change for our citizens here, and to actually, when we talk about innovation for government, sometimes it can be very self-centered. Get innovation and say, how can we do something better and it's for our benefit? Well, I'm also looking at how can we do things better and more rationally for our citizens' benefit? And to some extent, how can we set precedents, because we're a small government that can be quite nimble and that can be used elsewhere. We're an odd place here. I don't know whether you're aware of the term biosphere, the UNESCO biosphere, which is a status that's given normally to kind of nature reserves and things like that. Well, the Isle of Man is the only entire jurisdiction, the entire state that is a biosphere. So we kind of have a responsibility to look at how we merge or how we balance people, the environment, and also the economy within a space where all the things, all the normal economic activities take place, which is entirely different to kind of ways that you look at things elsewhere. We don't just look at the money, the capitalism, but we do look at all of those ethics and things that go around it. And that just naturally takes you into, when you're in the IT world, how do you handle data? How do you manage it properly? How do you make sure it's secure? How do you make sure it's used for the purpose it's intended and not for an unintended purpose? And this is where you find it's hard to stop me talking. So I'll pause.
I love it. That's fascinating. I love to hear your backstory. I too started in data fields before kind of the commercial internet. So I understand exactly where you're coming from. As you were talking, I was thinking about something that maybe people don't understand. And I think that this is having a huge impact on companies and the way that they do business now, that they're having a hard time adjusting to cybersecurity and privacy. And I think it is, I'm going to call it security through obscurity, where before, let's say, no one cares about this document, or it's just in a back room and I'm just going to lock the door and nothing's going to happen to it. So the internet really changed that. And I feel like a lot of companies that are having trouble in the digital realm, they sort of took their bad habits, the analog world, and just moved them into the digital and into the cloud. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely agree. We have an added perspective here that the Isle of Man, and there's a whole load of people in the world that have no idea where that is or what it is. That gave people an added a sense of security in the old world, because we've got 30 miles of sea around us. So you kind of feel safe and protected because no one's going to come here and attack you in any form. And then the internet came, and of course that changed. But the attitude was even further back here than you might have expected elsewhere. So things like that cyber security attack that I had, the hack, that comes as a great shock to people. They go, well, why is anyone attacking us here? Why would that be the case? Not really understanding that it isn't actually geographical anymore. They're not picking on the Isle of Man. They're picking on a bit of the internet that happens to be there. And that kind of shift in attitude from I'm safe because I can see my environs really does change quite substantially when you go onto the internet. And I think you're right. There's a lot of organizations that really haven't figured that out and really don't understand the fact that being online means being vulnerable for everybody, for however big an organization you are. I was in a bank that was a highly protected organization. The hackers that actually found their way into the organization took 4 years to do that. There was 4 years of effort. I couldn't devote 4 years of effort from the bank in defending that. So it was kind of being outmaneuvered. And there was an old adage that said that for security purposes, you just need to be stronger than everyone else, and the hackers will go away if your defenses are too strong, because they'll go, well, they're the easier things to do. In our particular circumstance, they did exactly the opposite. They said, well, these defenses are very strong, so that means there must be something interesting behind them. So we'll actually continue that way. So that thing about you not being caught by the bear because you can run faster than your friend really didn't work out for us. I do think, even though we've now been in this situation for so long, there's a vast number of organizations and companies and individuals who really don't understand what they're participating in. And I think that's the biggest danger, is that lack of understanding, that lack of transparency that helps people to understand, creates problems that people aren't aware of. And that's the biggest danger in life, really, isn't it? If you're walking into something you don't understand the risks of, then that's always going to create you a problem.
I know with, for example, with AI, I tell people that people treat AI like it's a teddy bear and it's actually a grizzly bear. So if someone put you in a room with a grizzly bear, I'm sure you have questions. Maybe do things differently. Yeah.
No. I think, like a lot of things in IT, there's always a good side and a bad side. And that's no different to life, really, is it? But you look at things like AI and you go, well, this can be used for fantastic things. But ultimately, you have to understand the risks. You have to understand what it can do and what it can't do before you can properly participate in that world. And if you don't, it's very dangerous. You can do things yourself that you don't want to do. You can reveal things that you don't want to do. It can introduce bias, because ultimately it's taking its feed from us. And we haven't worked out bias, be it unconscious or conscious bias or discrimination. If it's taking its cues from us at this moment in time, it hasn't worked that out yet. And on top of that, it doesn't have empathy or the kind of faults that we have. I actually started writing a book a few months ago, and I was getting into the mode of thinking that if you think that AI draws its intelligence from what we provide to it, and it's our original thoughts that it kind of amasses together to come up with its original thoughts, then as we start depending on AI more and more, we'll stop having original thoughts. And therefore, it will have exactly the same base of information to work on. So actually, we'll get dumber, and so will AI at the same time. That's a horrible thing to think about us doing to ourselves, and that we actually put ourselves into the position where we stagnate because we stop thinking. And I think that's the huge danger of AI, is that we rely on it too heavily and we believe it without question, without interrogation, without critical thinking. And I do have a huge concern that just generically across our society, removing from education upwards that necessity to criticize, to question, to actually think, is this right or is this wrong, and understand how to do that. There's a great book, and I'll probably quote the title wrong, which is Why Do I Need a Teacher If I've Got Google? If you read that, it sounds very threatening, although I've seen it on a lot of teachers' desks, probably looking for how they combat it. But what it really says is that you've got this information available. We should be teaching our children how to use it properly, how to be critical of it, how to go and say, is that right or is it wrong? To be able to tell the difference between good information and bad information. And I think because this is all being driven by data, AI is really amplifying that. It's kind of taking it forward quicker than we've reacted to it at all. That's where I saw the danger lying, is I want AI to do smart things, but I don't want people to stop thinking, because once they do, then that's a kind of hiding to nothing.
I agree with you completely, and I can't wait to read that book for sure. Your book, the book that you're writing. I think about this a lot. I guess a corollary to this, my sister and I laugh about this a lot because my parents, I guess they were polymaths. I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know what that word was, but I feel like I learned more from them than I did at school, right? Because they taught us how to think, they taught us how to reason, not just that George Washington chopped down a cherry tree, right? It's how to do things. And so in the digital age now, we laugh about the fact that a lot of people don't know how to read maps anymore because they use Google or they use Uber or whatever. And it's like you still have to know how to read a map. Like it's still like they're not infallible. They make mistakes. Sometimes my GPS tells me turn here. And it's like, oh, turn into the lake. No, I can't do that. Right. So I think that you're right. I'm concerned that people will use AI as a crutch in a way that makes them think, okay, I don't need to learn anything because this technology does this for me. What are your thoughts?
And if you kind of go to one side of that as well, we have the kind of fake news approach where things are inserted into there. I kind of go back to when my kids were slightly younger and they started using Facebook. And I remember my daughter coming to me and saying, I need to send some money somewhere. And you go, why do you need to send some money somewhere? She says, because there's this person in Africa who needs our help to do this, and we need to send them some money. And I said, well, how do you know that? She says, because Facebook said so. And you go, well, have you checked this? Have you gone and found out for another source? And that obviously hadn't occurred to her. She took that at face value as a trust. And that was a bit of an eye-opener for me and a kind of lesson for what needed to be taught. When generative AI kind of first came out, someone who asked, I think it was ChatGPT or a variant of it, to create a picture of salmon swimming upstream. And so it went away, it thought about this, and it came back with a picture of fillets of salmon actually swimming upstream because it looked at the data at the internet, and there were more images related to salmon of things that you bought in the shops than the actual fish. So if you think that one through, if you've got enough computing power and ability, you can insert things into the internet, those bots will use, that they'll take as a truth, but it can be a complete mistruth if you do it enough times, if you have enough power, if you do it, all of those things. So I was making the point to somebody, if China decided it didn't like me and it said Kurt Roosen is an idiot enough times on the internet, then if you asked AI what it thought of Kurt Roosen, it would say Kurt Rosen's an idiot because that was the base of its knowledge. That's a real scary element that can be brought there, especially when you look at the international flavor of that, what countries can do and the efforts that they put into these things, how they try and affect elections, etc. There's a real chance that they can affect the questions and answers that are coming out of AI to bend it in a particular way. And I find that quite challenging and something we need to think about.
Yeah, I love the way you're thinking about this problem. I agree 100% because I think for some reason, maybe this is a bias in and of itself where people think that something coming out of a digital realm is more true than something that maybe someone told you, right? So I've heard that a lot. I think doctors have this problem where they're like, you go to the doctor and then you bicker with them about something you saw on Google, even though your doctor knows you and they know your results, stuff like that. Yeah.
Although, think of it another way. We've got here, we're running an innovation challenge, a competition fairly soon. And one of the subjects we've got in there is AI. So we're trying to think of some cool things to do in a competition. So one of the things we're putting in there is what someone might put into our competition is an AI politician. Actually, when you think about that, if you've got AI absorbing all of your legislation in a very impartial way, it can tell you what the law is. It can tell you what you're able to do and what you're not without any emotion, without any bias in there. It's just taking it from what it's seen. Of course, you have to be very careful about what it ingests, where that comes from. We're kind of hopeful that we can take all of our legislation and put it into an AI thing, and actually the politicians can ask it questions. can kind of be a political advisor, but without the bias there. Now, that's actually quite a cool thing to do. But the key to that is knowing what data is going into it. If anybody had an ability to insert data into there, you can imagine how quickly that would get out of hand, because it would introduce the biases that people wanted to introduce. So, as I said, there's always kind of two sides to the coin on this. IT and technology can do wonderful things, but I think it's not realistic to say that it can self-regulate, that you can just let businesses do what they want and they'll always do things for the right reasons. We've never really found that to be true in the past, so I don't know why it should be that case in the future. But similarly, you don't want to over-regulate and stifle these things. So probably we're in a place now that is the toughest, that balance, that we've ever been in. But it requires the kind of collective brain power of people who are in that space to kind of put their head above the parapet and say, no, we have to do things this way. And this is the right way to do it, as opposed to just letting it happen.
Yeah, I agree. I guess a lot of times, maybe it's just the nature of the internet or the nature of algorithms that they want people's eyeballs or the attention, where I feel like I hear a lot of those extreme arguments on one side or the other. Don't hear enough about that middle part. Never regulate or regulate everything, as opposed, let's calm down, think it through, figure out what makes the best sense for what. And hopefully we have a lot more of those conversations and more level-headed folks being involved in these decisions, for sure.
I'm relatively new to being in government. So I kind of avoided it all of my career and kind of got to the end of my career and said, I need to try that. So I've been inside government for 18 months, and it does change your perspective slightly. Because if the government's doing its job correctly, it's obliged to do things to protect its citizens, to intervene in some way. So it can't just hold its hands up and say, whatever happens to you, and that's not our problem. Because government is there to take its society forward and look after its people. So this middle ground, because at the same time, a government also has to earn the income from taxes and all of those things that business generates. So you are absolutely totally stuck in that middle ground where you have to develop the economy, and at the same time, you have to take into consideration all of those things that people want you to do to protect them and the environment and all of those things around. And it's actually quite a responsibility. It's a really tough job, tougher than I'd considered when sitting out in the private sector saying, why aren't government doing this and why aren't they doing that? You start to see inside the real dichotomy you're stuck in, and how to deal with it is not simple.
Excellent. Tell me a little bit about privacy. How does privacy play into the spaces that you work in?
Well, obviously, every government is probably the largest holder of private information, one way or another, when you put all of its data sets together. And it's also the one that's going to be most heavily criticized if it fails to protect from a security perspective and also privacy. The problem, I guess, is a number of circumstances kind of exist where governments create their own problems by almost breaking their own rules. And because they consider, for whatever reason, whether it be national security or some other reason that they'll put in there, they see they kind of have to break in to people's privacy. And again, first of all, I'd say that's a really tricky balance. You know, when you're trying to protect the security of society against the privacy of everybody, there is a balance there as to how that's done. But we're kind of fortunate here in the Isle of Man. We only have 82,000 citizens here. So we're a tiny little country, and we're only a very small landmass, 29 miles high by 9 miles wide as an island. So everybody knows everybody. There are no secrets here. And you have to, and I've talked in the UK about this in government conferences, we can't hide behind a huge government, be anonymous. It's not possible. So actually, we have to take almost everything to the people. We have to be transparent to the government and say, hold our hands up and say, yeah, we're doing this. And we're doing this because of these reasons, not wait for that to be found out, because it will, because it's a small nation. But that's actually quite refreshing, because you get people to buy into the problem and say, and this is how we're solving it. And you may not agree with that, but at least you know about it. It comes back to that knowledge of what's happening to you again. A few years back, we had a citizen confidence survey. Governments do this every now and again just to kind of play with their own heads. But we had a 75% trust rating from our citizens. So our citizens said 75% of them were comfortable with our government doing whatever they're going to do, because we know they do the right thing. There was a caveat to that, which I kind of inserted at the time. And that was because I think perhaps that 75% of the populace thought we were so incompetent that even if we had the data, we wouldn't know what to do with it. But I do believe, even in government, that there is value to that transparency, to that saying, this is what we do, this is why we do it. If you object, you object. We take that on the chin. But we're going to convince you that we're doing this for the right reason, rather than keeping everything kind of secret. And as I say, letting people find out by themselves, I think, is a disaster of a thing to do.
I agree with that. I think transparency for organizations, whether they be governmental bodies or businesses, I think that's the future, right? So if they hadn't been transparent in the past, that's what is being expected of them, especially when they handle data of individuals.
We have GDPR. You mentioned the other man has an equivalence of that. So it has pretty much the same as European GDPR with a few changes. But I mean, there are some little known parts of that. So people consider that it's all to do with data. But there are actually some aspects of GDPR which are about processing. For example, there is a clause that if a decision is made with you by a machine in its entirety, you have the right to know that. You also have the right, if that is the case, to ask for that to be reviewed by a human. And that is already written into GDPR, but not many people pick that up. And that actually is quite contrary to AI and robot advice. And that is one of the things that the EU is wrestling with at the moment, its new AI Act and things, to say, well, do we keep that or don't we keep it? Do we find a middle ground? Now, certainly here, because we have to revise our GDPR laws as well, what we'll be desperately trying to do is find that middle ground. That one that says, in certain circumstances, yes, you can make these decisions using AI, but someone has to be accountable for that. Someone has to own that process. And I think one of the things with AI that's a bit disappointing, when you look at where AI is constructing books in the style of somebody, and he's basically reading their books and almost copying it, plagiarizing to a large extent. You go, well, someone set it that task to do it. So whoever set it that task did that and should have had the foresight to understand the implications, therefore should be liable for it. Not the AI. The AI is a tool. It's a very fast, very sophisticated tool, but it doesn't wander around the internet by itself looking for things to do. People tell it to do things, and they should be held accountable for what they do. And the companies that install these things should be accountable for what they do, the same way they're accountable for their employees and their actions in relation to other people.
I agree with that. Yeah, right now, I think people are doing the dog ate my homework. I don't know what happened. This bad thing happened and I'm not responsible. And it just can't be that way. It shouldn't be that way in the future. And as you say, the tools do what we tell it to do. So if it's doing things you don't want it to do, there is a problem. I think there was a story I read about, there were some researchers that said that they had AI looking at some x-rays, and the x-ray AI could tell the race of a person without actually seeing them or knowing any information. The researchers were looking at it when they asked, like, so why did it do that? And they're like, well, we don't know. I'm like, that's not acceptable. Like, you need to know. If it's doing something that it was not intended to do, you need to look at that. That's your responsibility. It's not the AI's responsibility.
Amazon went through that, where they were using AI to actually filter jobs. And what they discovered from looking at the statistics after the fact there was a significant bias against women. It was hiring men. So they kind of went back to the AI to try and figure out how it was doing that, or what was in there, because that wasn't the intent. And they went to the extreme of filtering out all of the gender information in there. So the AI didn't know that it was a man or a woman. But because it had access and was going and finding information from elsewhere, it could figure it out. So in the end, they concluded that they couldn't get the bias out. They couldn't figure out where the bias was coming from. So they stopped using it. Now, that's responsible use of this. They were checking what they were doing. They were finding out the results weren't what it should be doing. And if they couldn't fix it, then they removed that from the process. But a lot of people aren't doing that. And that's the problem at the moment.
That's true. That's true. Also, I saw another Amazon example where Amazon, they were denying so many candidates that at that rate that they would have run out of people. Like there were like no other people that they could possibly hire because it was just weeding people out. They had to figure out what was happening with the algorithm. But you're right. It's like you have to definitely look at that. Also, I think one other thing that concerns me about AI that I'm seeing is it's not a major move, but I'm hearing people say, okay, we want to use AI and have it to do things autonomously, which I think you should not do. You need to have a human who understands what the AI is doing, like not have AI go like install applications, or some researcher had AI and had them doing these autonomous tasks. And the AI decided that they were going to deny him access to the system because they felt like he was getting in the way of their objective. It's something you see in a movie, right?
Absolutely. But it is kind of getting to those sort of points. And that's why I say, I think we're in a challenge at the moment about getting that balance between, let's call it good and evil. Sometimes it can be as stark as that. If we can't intellectually figure that out, then we shouldn't be setting AI off using that kind of lack of foresight as an excuse. I do believe we're at a turning point. I do believe if we do it right, this can be incredibly positive. I believe if we do it wrong, I don't think it's doomsday and disaster. But I think there are aspects of our lives that could be badly affected. And I particularly worry about this inherent bias that could exist here. Now, again, when I was kind of thinking about writing the book, trying to think about how you arrive at some decision that you make as a human. And if you think about it, there's a whole range of things that are there. And I was trying to build up, okay, why did I make this decision at this particular point in my life? What affected that? And what you look at is actually an imperfect mind does that. You don't remember everything that you do. You remember certain bits of what you do. There was an example I have in the book, which was a bit of a film I remember. I don't remember the rest of the film, and I don't remember how it arrived there or where it went to, but something stuck in my head. And that affected the way I thought about something further on. Now, if you look at AI, it operates in a perfect world, not an imperfect one. It doesn't remember fragments. So it will come to different decisions that we would, because it's looking at the perfect answer, where none of our answers to anything we do are perfect. We do have biases. Some of those are positive ones. Should we do the right thing? Shouldn't we do the right thing? What determines what's right and wrong in there? What's a good thing? What's a bad thing? All of those are very subjective, and they're built up in layers and fragments of what we get over our lives. So when you start making the perfect thinking machine, actually that imperfection is lost, and that loses what I suppose we call humanity in there.
The thing that you're talking about exactly, I call it wisdom.
No.
I don't think the AI systems can ever be wise. Just getting data doesn't mean that you have deep enough knowledge or understanding of it.
On LinkedIn, I asked a question.
Mm-hmm.
How do you define intelligence? And the best answer I got back was intelligence is defined by being able to derive original questions. And I thought, that's quite deep, because that's not what AI does. AI doesn't come up with the questions, it comes up with the answers. I thought, okay, that I can go with, that I can figure out. So if you then take that as a definition of intelligence, we're not actually creating artificial intelligence. We're creating machine learning. It's doing what it thinks we want as the answer to that, but it wouldn't come up with an original question. So I think that's quite a cool way of thinking about it.
I love that too. It's trying to give you an answer based on the past. And the past,
Yes.
the future is not going to be like the past. So I can't know what that's going to be. I've heard someone say, someone that I know, instead of calling it artificial intelligence, they call it artificial capability. And I think that's probably closer to what it's doing. So it's not really smart in that way. It's just doing things that would take a human longer or do it in a different way. I'm concerned about inference in AI systems. So when you're talking about the Amazon example, I'm not picking on them exactly, but to me, I feel like AI systems fancy math. And so they look for patterns and different things like that. The inferences I'm concerned about, let me make an example. Let's say, oh, this is a good one, Cambridge Analytica. So Cambridge Analytica, when that thing happened, one of the researchers that was on that project, he said that they had a thing called the Kit Kat project. And so what they found in the data is that people that they interact with on Facebook, if they put out an anti-Semitic message and they liked it or something, they correlated that with their data and they said that those people also tend to like Kit Kat bars. So that's what they call it, the Kit Kat project. So does that mean that if you like a Kit Kat bar, that you're anti-Semite? You know what I'm saying? So I think those inferences can be made just by over collection of data and looking at the wrong thing. What are your thoughts?
Oh yes, I know. There's a lady called Susie Algray, who's again she's a human rights lawyer, but she's also been involved in the data world. She gave a talk fairly recently, and she was talking about the capabilities that she saw that they had to kind of rein back. One of them being that genuinely, and it was doing it with a degree of accuracy. There was a system that was looking at people's faces on the street, and it could tell with a high degree of accuracy their political leanings just by looking at their face. And you thought that sounds impossible, but the statistics were sound. You think, well, what's that useful for? Why do you want to do that? I had, one entry into my innovation, my challenge last year, which was about detecting race at borders. We don't have borders here because we're kind of linked to the UK, so it was irrelevant to us anyway. But again, for any people who do, you thought, why do I want to know someone's race? What's the purpose of that? And if you go back to GDPR, the kind of protections that are put in there are relevancy. You hold data, but you have to show that it's relevant to something that you're doing, and you have to show why. And there are circumstances in which the data protection commissioner could say, well, that's not a valid way or a valid thing to do. And then, of course, that layering on top of that, there are all of the, what do we think is ethical there? Why would they be doing that? China uses the kind of race detection in its community. And without knowing or investigating, I'm sure other countries do as well. But they shouldn't. We see that as society as unacceptable. And that's where it comes back to, again, who's the society? Is it the government? Is it the people? Is it the people like Susie, who's the human rights lawyers who are kind of defending those boundaries? It's a tough one, but it's a battle that has to be consistently fought, and people have to be prepared to do it, to say, I'm not sure about this, and goes back to that accountability. I am going to hold somebody accountable if this happens and it's been raised, or if it's being held in secret and happening. I think sometimes technology can just kind of reflect some of the problems we have in societies in general. And I think even more so now in that we're using AI, taking information about it's a view of society that may not be rounded and may not be unbiased.
That's tremendous. Well, yeah, Susie Albury, she's been on the podcast, so you're in good company.
Oh, good. Yeah, do you know she's also from the Isle of Man?
I did not know that. Oh, that's so cool.
She left here a few years ago. Her siblings live here, which is how we get her to come and do talks for us without having to pay her a big fee.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Yeah.
She was the Interception of Communications Commissioner for a number of years. So we do have a body here that actually you can appeal to if your phone is tapped or anything like that, and you think that wasn't done in the correct way. So yeah, she's a very interesting lady.
Very. I totally agree with that. So if it were the world according to you, Kurt, and we did everything that you said, what would be your wish for privacy or innovation or IT, cyber, anything, anywhere in the world, whether it be regulation, human behavior, or technology?
I would kind of hark back to that. I want technology to work for us, and that's for people. I accept the fact it has to work for corporations because there's an economic aspect to it, but within boundaries. Ultimately, nothing we should do should really take away from the fact that there are people at the other end of these. As I see it, and there's a kind of perspective of the Isle of Man in there, whilst I'm not an advocate of secrecy, because that goes against transparency, I am ultimately an advocate of privacy. People have a right to privacy. And ultimately, every element of government and society should be attuned to protecting that. That kind of should be its job. And it should help people who feel aggrieved by a process or something that's happening. So for me, it would be a kind of realization, and this sounds like something that someone would say in a beauty pageant here. It's not quite world peace, but it's that understanding. Actually, we'd all get on a lot better if we were a lot more transparent about what we did, and took responsibility for the things we did wrong and admit to them, as opposed to trying to hide them all.
I agree with that completely. Well, this has been tremendous episode. I am so happy that we were able to connect, and I love your perspective, and I can't wait for your book to come out.
Yeah, I keep saying that. I'm going to have to stop talking about my book, but I'm going on holiday soon, and part of that is to kind of there's a hotel I'm going to that has igloos, so I'm going to sit in an igloo and write the rest of the book.
Well, we'll be waiting. We'll be waiting whenever you're ready. So, well, thank you so much for being on the show. This is tremendous. I'm sure that the audience will really love your insights. I think it's spot on.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me, and hope to speak to you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.